name is Erin Corcoran, and I'm the director of the UNH School of Law's Social Justice Institute. And the Institute is the hub at the law school for scholarship, programming, and training our future lawyers on all things related to social justice and public service. Just to give you an example of some of the events and programming that we've done in the past, we've done issues surrounding the war on terror, human rights. We actually recently showed a film at Red River on the human rights situation, in particular rape in the Congo, what's going on there with the women there. We've also done events related to the death penalty and juvenile justice. And this fall we'll be in collaboration with the University of New Hampshire to host a national conference on violence against women. But my particular expertise is in human rights and refugee issues. So I was absolutely delighted when the Lantos Foundation, Katrina in particular, approached me and the dean about co-hosting this event here tonight at Red River Theater. I couldn't think of a better partner in getting this information out to the community. So thank you so much for this tremendous opportunity. And I just wanted to say, you know, this film, as Katrina said, is going to be an extraordinary and an extraordinarily hard issue. Prior to coming to the university, I did work for the Lawyers Committee on Human Rights, and one of the issues that we did work on was human rights in North Korea. And not a lot of people know what's going on there. And so I think this is an incredible opportunity to educate ourselves about the horrific abuses that are going on, and we'll hear much more and learn much more from our experts here this evening. I also wanted to again thank Red River Theater for allowing this event to be here tonight. And in addition to Connie, I'd also like to thank Kalina Guzman. I've worked with her several times, and she's been a terrific partner. I also like to thank the Lantos Foundation and Babette for putting this terrific event together. Without her, we wouldn't be here tonight. So thank you, Babette. And then finally, I wanted to thank Dean Broderick for all of his support, for being here, and all his support with the Social Justice Institute. So thank you very much, and I'll hand this mic back over to Katrina.
It's now my privilege to introduce our two honored guests. We are really thrilled, and I just met Greg for the first time this evening as well, but Greg Scarlato is the new Executive Director of the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, which is sort of the premier human rights organization attempting to undertake one of the most difficult challenges any human rights entity could face, namely to educate, to expose, and to lobby on behalf of policy efforts that will begin to address and ameliorate the incredible human rights catastrophe that is North Korea. And he knows an extraordinary amount about this issue, and we really are unbelievably fortunate to have him here. We are also incredibly fortunate to have Ambassador Robert King, who is a dear personal friend and who is the Obama administration special envoy on human rights in North Korea. So this is his portfolio. This is Bob's brief, and this is what he devotes pretty much every waking minute of his life to. Dr. King, prior to assuming his new responsibility, served as the Chief of Staff, the Staff Director for the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, and for many years was also the Chief of Staff for my late father, Congressman Tom Lantos. He has traveled to North Korea many, many times, played a key role in the passage of the 2004 North Korea Human Rights Act. And we really have here on this stage in front of you two of the leading experts to be found anywhere in the world on this issue. So if I may, gentlemen, I would like to ask each of you, I'm going to pass off this microphone now, I would like to ask each of you to make a few opening remarks and comments, if you would, and then we're eager to have your questions and comments before we go on to the film. We'll start with Ambassador King. We're great.
Ambassador King, Dr. Lantos, thank you very much for the very kind introduction. I am pleased and honored to be here today. I would also like to thank the distinguished members of the board, Dr. Kay King, Dean Broderick, Ambassador Sweat, and Ms. Babette Ridmar. Thank you very much for your wonderful work and your very warm and kind hospitality. To me, this is an extraordinary occasion. It is my first public appearance as the new Executive Director of the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. Throughout the few decades of my life, I have learned to dismiss bad omens and cherish good omens, and I think this is an extraordinarily good omen. I was born and raised in communist Eastern Europe, in Romania. After that, I became the first Romanian ever to study in South Korea. I spent about 10 years there, did a BA and MA, and I have been deeply concerned about this issue of human rights in North Korea. This is a very special evening because I'm fully aware of the extraordinary legacy of the late Congressman Lantos and of the fact that the Lantos Foundation continues that legacy. I am fully aware of the extraordinary work that Ambassador King has done dealing with both human rights in Eastern Europe and also in North Korea, working during his years working with Congressman Lantos and afterwards, and also in his current quality as Ambassador for Human Rights Issues in North Korea. HRNK, the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, is an organization that was established in 2009 to reveal the truth about the human rights violations that have been happening in North Korea. For the past 10 years, HRNK has been producing extremely valuable research on the relevant human rights issues in North Korea. HRNK has published proof of the Gulag system in North Korea in the form of satellite images of the prison camps confirmed by the testimony of those who survived those camps. We have also published very important studies on North Korean refugees and the regime's use of food to enhance and enforce political control. HRNK has formulated a set of 10 policy recommendations. The first recommendation is very much in sync with the main mission and objective of the Lantos Foundation. That is to broaden US policy on North Korea to include bilateral and multilateral approaches to human rights issues. The second objective, as formulated by HRNK, is to persuade China to respect the rights of North Korean refugees. Many of these refugees are captured and repatriated to North Korea, forcibly repatriated in violation of existing international obligations to protect the rights of refugees. Many of them face detention in camps and prisons, or in many cases even death, especially if they have come across either South Koreans during the time they spent in third countries, or if they have come across, if they have come in contact with any type of religious material. The third recommendation is to establish a first asylum program for North Korean refugees, as was done for the Vietnamese boat people in the late 1970s. And the movie that we're just about to watch together tonight will tell you something. It's very hard to watch. It's truly hard to watch. And as Dr. K. King was pointing out before this program, the things that are actually happening, the violations of human rights that are actually happening in North Korea are much, much harsher than the hard truth that this movie reveals. HRNK also recommends fully implementing the North Korea Human Rights Act. We all know that the late Congressman Lantos was deeply involved with this act. Ambassador King worked with the late Congressman on the North Korea Human Rights Act. The recommendations that HRNK has are to better educate embassy personnel in U.S. embassy personnel in countries where North Koreans have fled, third countries, and also to increase the staffing levels of U.S. personnel, in particular Korean speakers, at such missions that may come across North Korean refugees in third countries, and also to establish a hotline with UNHCR and the Republic of Korea. Fifth, to provide food aid that reaches the hungry, and these days the resumption of food aid to North Korea, it has become a hot issue again. There is a big question as to where it is advisable or not to resume that food aid. I'd only like to say one thing, that transparency is of the essence, and we should all remember that the US government was funding a USAID, a USAID PL 480 humanitarian assistance to North Korea, food assistance being implemented by a consortium of 5 NGOs led by Mercy Corps. their activities in North Korea stopped, not because that was the will of the American people, the US government, but because the North Korean government refused to conduct a nutritional survey. And as we all know, this is the way we run projects in this part of the world, where it is of the essence to have accountable and transparent management. HRNK has also recommended that we need to provide essential information directly to the people of North Korea. There are public broadcasters here in the United States, Radio Free Asia and Voice of America, and also South Korean-based broadcasters staffed primarily by North Korean defectors who are broadcasting into North Korea, bringing news of the world, of South Korea, and what is happening in the outside world to North Koreans. Many years ago, it may have been doubtful whether North Koreans were receiving this broadcasting. Over the recent years, evaluations seem to indicate that listenership in North Korea has been on the increase, despite the tight controls that are in place. Another issue that is of the essence is to provide opportunities for North Korean defectors to improve the lives of their countrymen. Yes, there are North Korean defectors in South Korea, and once again, crossing will tell you about how difficult the road of crossing can be. What an ordeal, what a perilous road this is. Nevertheless, North Koreans have managed to reach North Korea. There are right now over 20,000 North Korean defectors, refugees in the south, in South Korea. There are maybe just a few over 100 here in the United States as well. This is not a very high number. Freedom of travel is severely restricted in North Korea, and that is why it is very hard to travel to the border areas. It is very hard for anybody but people from the border areas to defect across the river into China. And basically, by comparison, for example, Cuba is a country of 10 million. There are about 1 million in the Miami area, 1 million Cubans. There are about 23.5 million North Koreans, according to a relatively recent UN survey, and there are only 20,000 North Koreans in South Korea. That is a low number by comparison, and of those 20,000, not too many are actually intellectuals, people with university degrees, for example. That's why it's very important to cultivate and cherish intellectual leadership within the community of North Korean defectors. There's a very impressive North Korean lady, Dr. Lee Eran, who was awarded in 2010 the International Woman of Courage Award. I had the privilege of meeting her in South Korea. She has established a cooking school for young North Korean defectors. When she received this award, she was extremely honored to meet with First Lady Michelle Obama and with the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton as well. It was an extraordinary way of recognizing the achievements of somebody who is truly a leader amongst the community of North Korean defectors there. We need more like her. You have also come across the issue of abductees, foreign nationals. Well, first and foremost, South Koreans who were abducted and taken to North Korea, South Korean POWs who were never returned after the Korean War, and also the issue of abductees from other countries, from Japan in particular, but not only. This morning I was on the phone with a Romanian gentleman, Gabriel Bumba is his name. The story of his sister is a truly amazing and extraordinarily sad story. She was a Romanian defector herself in the late 1970s. She was an artist living in Italy. She had escaped from communist Romania. She disappeared, and her family never knew anything about her for decades. Only a few years ago, in 2007, the family of long-lost Doina Bumba was watching a BBC documentary produced by an English producer on the story of US Army deserters who were foolish enough, just a handful of them, to cross the border into North Korea for a variety of reasons, because they were depressed, because they were drunk, because they were afraid of going to war elsewhere. Anyway, one of these defectors, James Dresnock, had 2 sons. And the family of this lady realized that there was a striking resemblance between the sons of this American man and their long-lost daughter. So they got in touch with Japanese abductee groups, and they came to realize that this lady had actually been abducted by North Korean agents. She was lured with promises of an art exhibit in Japan. She made a stopover in Pyongyang. She was taken, never allowed to leave North Korea again, forced to teach Romanian language and culture to North Korean agents. These two countries were allies during the Cold War. If citizens of countries that were supposedly allies were taken, what might have happened to others? She ended up marrying this U.S. Army deserter, James Dresnog. They had 2 sons. She died of lung cancer in the late 1990s. She had a very unhappy life. Apparently this was not a good relationship. Her husband was quite abusive. Off the record, apparently he has admitted, although in public she wouldn't admit that indeed she was his wife. Off the record, in private, he admits that his wife was from Eastern Europe. He is from Romania, Doina Bumba. But he wouldn't admit it publicly because his 2 sons had been trained to work with for North Korean government in some capacity, possibly for their foreign service. It is, as we address human rights in North Korea, I think that it is of the essence to remember that there are 2 Koreas. It is of the essence to remember that Asia is the engine of future growth in the 21st century. It is of the essence to remember that the other Korea, South Korea, a staunch friend, ally of the United States, is one of the world's most robust economies, the world's 15th largest economy, a lead producer in many areas, and also a vibrant democracy relying on a vibrant middle class and basically being proud to be the world's most connected country. On the other hand, North Korea and Burma are 2 countries that have miserably failed to capitalize on the great progress in Asia. And North Korea has truly remained as simply, unfortunately, a black hole on the map of Asia. The movie we're going to watch together tonight is very much the product of a South Korean offensive, not only on the shipbuilding, microchip, or TV screen or a TV display front, but also on the cultural front. There is the so-called Hallyu, the Korean wave. South Korean culture, movies, music that have taken Asia by storm and have become extraordinarily popular. However, this movie Crossing is also part of this Korean wave, but tells a very different story. It tells the different story of North Korean refugees, of how difficult and perilous the road of defection is, of how painful it is to leave loved ones behind. It doesn't tell all of the stories, all of those sad stories of North Korean refugees. There is more to the story. Of course, they have to reach South Korea or other third countries and then rebuild their lives and learn how to live, love, and work again. Before turning the floor to Ambassador King, I would like to say that since I'm the new executive director of HRNK, I haven't been officially anointed yet. That's going to happen soon. I haven't talked to my board yet. I cannot talk too much about the future of HRNK, but what I would like to tell you is that I promise that HRNK will continue to do what we do best, conduct research and report publication in those areas that are essential to human rights in North Korea. And I would very much look forward to also engaging on other fronts as well, for example, on the public affairs front, through events such as this event tonight that will bring the issue of human rights in North Korea to the American public, and also through an offensive, a large-scale offensive on the social media front. That being said, I am absolutely delighted and impressed that so many of you are here in the audience tonight. On behalf of HRNK, I would like to thank you very much. And I also look forward to answering some of your questions in the Q&A. Please remember that I'm new, green, and vulnerable, so questions.
One thing that Greg is not is new, green, and vulnerable. He represents one of the many organizations that function in Washington that look at North Korea from a variety of perspectives because of the importance and significance of this place. And the Committee on Human Rights in North Korea is one of the most important in terms of highlighting the human rights problems in North Korea and how significant, how important they are. The movie you're going to see is a good movie. It is a well-made movie. It is a movie that has a real story to tell. It's the kind of movie that was shown in South Korea, and in many ways it typifies the things that Greg was talking about in terms of the quality of what's happening in South Korea. South Korea is a place that 60 years ago, when the Korean War was underway, was one of the poorest places on the face of the earth. South Korea is now one of the most advanced countries on the face of the earth. South Korea today has better connectivity times on the internet than we do in the United States. South Korea is #1 in terms of internet access and speed of access. South Korea is a place where the number of cell phones, 1.3 per capita. Don't ask me why people need another third of a cell phone, but it says something about the nature of South Korea. And this film shows the values, the quality, the caliber of what kind of a place South Korea is today. At the same time, this film depicts what is going on just across the 38th parallel in North Korea. These are people who share the same genetic inheritance with the people of South Korea. They're related. They're very sensitive and aware of their relationship. North Korea is one of the poorest countries on the face of the earth. North Korea has, as we mentioned, serious problems in terms of human rights. State Department does a number of reports on human rights issues. North Korea's human rights are categorized as deplorable. The report produced by the State Department on religious freedom has North Korea designated a country of particular concern. In terms of trafficking, North Korea is a Tier 1 country. It's one of the most problematic of countries in terms of dealing with trafficking issues. The kinds of problems in North Korea, you're going to see this. This picture sort of assumes a fairly good understanding of what's going on in North Korea. The things you see are, as my wife said, as Greg quoted her, worse than what, things are worse than what you see in the movie. In terms of information, North Korea is a place where, in the rest of the world, we are increasingly connected, plugged in, know what's going on. The globalization that produced such interesting things as what we've seen in places like Libya and Egypt and Tunisia in the last little while. North Korea is not plugged in. In North Korea, if you own a radio, the radio can only be set to be tuned to one station, the government station. It is illegal to listen to broadcasts from foreign countries. And there are stories that have appeared in the South Korean press periodically about people who have been executed because they have fixed their radios to be able to tune into foreign radio broadcasts. South Korea is a place where in the last couple of years you've been able to get a cell phone. But cell phones in South Korea, if you are, in North Korea, if you are a North Korean and you purchase a cell phone, your cell phone is incapable of making international calls. You can call other people in North Korea who have cell phones. You cannot call anywhere else. There are a few creative North Koreans who have purchased Chinese cell phones, and the Chinese are very enterprising, and along the Chinese border there are cell towers, and surprisingly they put a lot of them right close to the border, so that North Koreans have taken a chance and used those cell phones to make international calls using the Chinese cell phone system. Again, the risk is considerable. Using a foreign cell phone can result in being executed. There are stories, again, that have appeared in the North Korean press who've been told stories of people being executed for using a cell phone to make an international call. What people do is they make an appointment as to when they're going to call. They talk for less than 2 minutes because that's about what it takes, the security, to find out that somebody is using a cell phone and identify where you are and send somebody to try to apprehend you. North Korea is a place where there is no religious freedom. You don't have the option or opportunity of practicing a religion. There is a Russian Orthodox Church in Pyongyang. It was built after Russia came into existence with the death of the Soviet Union. It was apparently an effort by the North Korean government to appeal to religious Russians who might come to North Korea. There is a Protestant church there. The only time that we have seen that people have been observed worshiping there are when foreigners are visiting and they have a service so that foreigners will be able to attend church at a Presbyterian church. But basically, the ability to worship as you might want is not permitted in North Korea. It is illegal to have religious material, to have copies of the Bible, to have copies of religious writings of any kind. This is a country where there are no free elections, where there's no due process. Of people who end up in prisons, less than 25% have actually gone through a legal proceeding to put them in there, where there's been some pretense, at least, of putting them in prison for on the basis of some legal process. This is a country where there are extensive political prisoners. There are at least 200,000 people that are estimated to be in political prisons in North Korea. Being in a political prison is not, you know, where you have a cell and you're locked up and you only get an hour of sunshine a day. This is a place where you are forced to do hard labor. I met a young man who was in a political prison, not because he had done anything, but because his parents were in prison. And he had been born in prison, so since his parents were in prison, he was kept there as well. There's the 3-generation rule. If you are sent to a political prison, your children and your parents are sent with you. This is the kind of idea that, you know, if you're guilty, your relatives must be guilty as well. This young man, who had been born in prison, testified before the European Parliament about conditions in North Korea. He was 16, 17, was carrying a huge piece of equipment, moving it from one place to another. It was obviously too heavy for him to be carrying. He dropped it and damaged the piece of equipment. The police, in punishment for his doing this, cut off the middle of his third finger at the second joint. Just chopped it off. He still is missing that part of his finger because he dropped a piece of equipment that he shouldn't have been carrying in the first place. This is the kind of situation that you find in the prison camps and the conditions that are there. One of the things that is interesting in terms of North Korea is the inability to leave North Korea. You are not permitted to leave the country. If you want to leave, you have to get permission. It's complicated. You have to have a justified reason. There has to be expectation that you'll return. What happens is that there are some places where people are willing to take the risk and cross the border. You don't cross into South Korea because the demilitarized zone is so heavily mined that there is very little chance that anybody would make it across that border. The border you cross is the border into China. Now, getting you into China is not necessarily a solution to getting out of North Korea. The Chinese do not like dealing with refugees who may be fleeing from North Korea, and the result is that if you are found in China and are determined to be a North Korean refugee, what happens is you are then returned to North Korea. If you are returned to North Korea, for whatever reason you chose to leave, you are very likely you will be sent to a re-education camp or a political prison camp for a period of time. It's not an easy thing to get out. What has happened is people who leave will go to China, and then what they will do is try to get from China out. Some of them have been able to cross China and get into other areas. Some of them have crossed to Mongolia. Mongolia is a tough area to cross into because it's largely desert. and crossing over the desert border from China into Mongolia has certain risks. If you go out across one of the other Chinese borders, you're crossing 1,000 miles of China to get out, and there are definite risks in terms of doing that. Yet people are willing to take risks to get out because of the concern for continuing to live in North Korea. When I was in Seoul earlier this year, I met with a group of refugees who were in the process of going through a resettlement in South Korea. They were in a camp that, not a camp, they were in a center where they were being taught what life in South Korea is like. And I met with a group of 6 women. One of these women, I was asking, you know, did any of you try to get out and were you returned by the Chinese and then had to make another try? Of the 6 women that I was talking to, every one had tried at least once and been caught by the Chinese, returned to the North Koreans, sent to prison camp, and then were able finally to get back to the communities where they had lived. One of the women said, I tried 5 times and was returned 5 times. The last time when I made an effort to get out, I decided that I was going to make it or I was going to kill myself. I had arsenic with me and I was prepared to take it if I had been captured by the Chinese. She said, I got out, I made it to South Korea. For me to get out, I had to leave behind my 2 children. And now I am doing everything I can to get those children out of North Korea so that they can be with me. These kinds of stories are the kinds of stories you hear all the time of what happens to people in North Korea in terms of their efforts to get out. Way too long, excuse me. Last comment, the situation of food. North Korea is a country that produces about 80% of the food it needs to feed its own population. That's average year. There are bad years when it's worse than that. There are good years when they seldom produce enough to feed the population. Now, feeding the population does not mean feeding them the way Americans are used to eating. Feeding the population means being able to have enough food to be able to survive. The government makes the decision on how the rations are allocated. And certain kinds of people, the elite in Beijing, the military, get reasonably good rations. People who are considered socially questionable, their loyalty to the regime is in question, find themselves in a situation where they have far less than what they need to survive. And one of the things that was interesting, there have been some recent groups that have taken a look at conditions in North Korea in terms of food. One of the things that they said is that everybody they talked to, particularly in the outlying areas, not in the capital, could tell you when they last had protein. I had an egg for my birthday 7 months ago. We had a chicken for a special occasion several months ago. But in most cases, this was not something that people were able to say, yeah, I had an egg for breakfast today. The movie gives you some of the flavor of this, but understand that what you're going to see in this movie is what's going on in North Korea in spades. I've talked way too long. Katrina, how do you want to handle questions, or what do you want to do? Or shall we just go to the movie?
We'd like to give people the opportunity to ask just a few questions before we start the film. So please, if you have a question, stand up. We also have microphones if you would like to use a microphone.
My question is about this post, or I guess ongoing Libyan situation, and what some folks are saying is a new mode of addressing foreign policy. Like the president has said, you know, here's a leader who's harming his people, so we'll step in. and some writers are speculating that we might have created a scenario where we may step in more human rights type situations. Is that a possibility? Or what can we as Americans, even as average citizens, do to be supportive? Because obviously everything you guys are saying, I mean, how can we just let this happen? What do you think can be done?
Let me make a couple of quick questions or comments, and I'll let Greg respond. One of the things that was unique about Libya was that the Libyan government was attacking its own population, bombing them, firing guns, firing weapons at them. The United Nations, a couple of years ago, talked about and adopted a resolution dealing with the responsibility to protect, basically declaring that it is the responsibility of a government to protect its citizens. And the concern was that clearly Libya was harming its citizens. I don't think that people have gone so far as to interpret that if a government is not providing health care, that we have to go to war against them.
True in the United States.
Well, we won't talk about that. But what I think that the situation is that in extreme situations there may be justification for taking action like that. The way it's been interpreted so far is situations where the population of a country have risen up against their government, where they have a repressive government, have not had an opportunity to change the government through peaceful electoral means. They've, the United States, the United Nations has been willing to step in. We have been involved in Libya to some extent, but only to a limited extent. And there has been an effort to carefully prescribe what we're willing to do. Certainly in terms of what we do, we ought to try to do everything we can to assist countries like North Korea, where the human rights situation is an extremely drastic one.
Professor King, there are certainly marked differences between North Korea and what has happened in the Middle East. You're aware, of course, of the role of the social media, the role that the social media played in the Middle Eastern revolutions. North Korea is a country that's severely and strictly isolated from the rest of the world. This is not to say that Robespierre, Danton, or Marat had internet. No, they did not. Something might happen at a given point in time. After all, the Eastern Europeans didn't have social media. The Romanians didn't have social media in December 1989. What makes the Korean situation extremely complex is the tyranny of proximity. Seoul, South Korea's largest city, an international financial, economic, and trade center, is within cannon range from North Korea. So one has to take into account this tyranny of proximity as well when considering contingency planning for different alternatives that might happen at a future point in time. You're probably aware of those two incidents that happened last year. On March 23rd, 2010, March 26th, 2010, a South Korean ship was sunk. The Cheonan was sunk by a North Korean torpedo, and on November the 23rd, the North Koreans shelled a South Korean island. South Korea showed extraordinary restraint, just because South Korea is a responsible member of the community of nations and refused to escalate the confrontation.
Yes.
What is South Korea trying to do to help the people of the North?
South Koreans have done a great deal, particularly in terms of refugees who've left North Korea. Refugees who've been able to get out of North Korea and have been able to make it to other locations. The South Korean government has put a major effort into assisting them. They've brought them to South Korea. They've gone through programs to help train them, to prepare them to live in a society like South Korea. They provide social help. They provide job training. They provide various other kinds of assistance, and including providing funds to help them during a period of adjustment, that kind of thing. In terms of other things, South Koreans continue to try to provide information to North Korea. South Korean broadcasts, many South Korean radio stations broadcast into North Korea. If there are North Koreans who are willing to risk listening to foreign broadcasts, they will do that with South Korea. The South Koreans have been very active and very involved in terms of their commitment to North Korea.
We'll have just one more question. Yes, the gentleman back there.
The role of China. Does the Chinese government show any interest in seeing some sort of reform in North Korea? And is change inside North Korea possible without the interest and the active engagement of the government of China?
That's a very interesting question. It's quite interesting to see what's happened in China. 30 years ago, when I made my first trip to China, China was a very different place than it was today. Everybody was riding bicycles, everybody was wearing Mao suits. Those of you who've been to China nowadays know that isn't quite the case anymore. American automobiles all over the streets of Beijing. Very clearly the Chinese would like to see North Korea move in the direction that they have chosen to go with economic reform, with the kind of economic changes that have taken place in China. The North Koreans seem to be less than enthusiastic about following the Chinese model. The last time Kim Jong-il was in China, the Chinese made a point of showing him, you know, new factories, kinds of things that have happened just across the border from North Korea in an effort to kind of push the North Koreans in that direction. North Koreans have been very cautious about any kind of economic reform following the Chinese model. I think, as Greg said, there was the North Koreans tend to think of what happened to Ceausescu in Romania as more the model than what has happened in China, and they have tended to be very resistant to change.
Certainly. For a 10-year period, two former South Korean presidents, former president, the late President Kim Dae-jung and the late President Roh Moo-hyun, proceeded with the so-called sunshine policy of opening towards North Korea. South Korean investment, South Korean economic assistance was extended to the North Koreans. In exchange, most unfortunately, that policy ended up being failure because what the North Koreans had to give in exchange was developing their missile and nuclear programs, threatening their neighboring countries. So as Ambassador King pointed out, indeed the North Koreans may have come to the realization that the Kim regime is facing a very tough dilemma. In order to survive over the long run, they need some type of change, some type of reform. However, if they change, if they reform, at least even economically, that might bring about the very end of the Kim dynasty and the Kim regime. So this is the dilemma that they have been facing and that they will continue to face over the coming years.
And just to add one more comment in response to that question, I think that we find a situation in China where, as our two distinguished guests have said, they very much want to see North Korea move in the direction of economic reform and at a very bare minimum raising the standard of living for their people. But China, I think, also has very great fears of a catastrophic collapse of the regime because they do not want to, in fact, have literally millions of North Korean refugees pouring over their borders. And so the push and the pull of, on the one hand, the fear of the North Korean regime of change, understanding that that could lead to its collapse, the fear of the Chinese of a catastrophic collapse of the regime, has resulted in a sort of tragic stability to some degree in the region. And the hostages of this tragic stability really are the North Korean people themselves. I'd like you to join me in thanking our two distinguished guests. Greg and Ambassador King have kindly agreed to stay for a little while when the film is over if you have additional questions and would like to approach them one-on-one to discuss what you've seen. I was planning to speak at the end of the film, but I think I'm going to, in a way, make my closing remarks now because, as all of us have alluded to, you're in for a powerful but a very challenging experience, and I'm not sure you're really going to want to hear from any of us in a formal sense when this movie is done. And so I'd like to close by saying that when I first saw this film a few weeks ago, words failed me. I literally couldn't speak. I was so moved and so struck and so frankly saddened by what I saw. And my guess is that for most of you, you will feel that same way tonight at the end of this movie. But if our words fail us, it is my hope that our hearts will not fail us. That we will, each of us, have the courage and have the determination to do something. To commit when you leave here tonight that you will not simply have viewed a tragedy, but you will have been touched by it enough to have made the decision to do something about it in your life. When you exit the theater tonight, there will be a table there with more information and with information specifically about the Committee on Human Rights in North Korea. I encourage you to support their work. As I've said, they are one of the most effective organizations working in this field. And so with that, I want to thank you all for being here tonight. I also want to pay tribute to Babette of the Lantos Foundation staff, who worked tirelessly to make this event and this evening possible. And I hope that you will be ambassadors. We're fortunate to have an ambassador here tonight, but I hope that you will be ambassadors going forward, sharing this story, passing it around through not only modern social media, but that old-fashioned form of social media, by talking to everybody you know. And since we are here in New Hampshire, that famous first-in-the-nation primary state, some of the people you will have a chance to get to know in the coming months will be people who may become the next leader of our country, or may be renewed as the leader of our country. So please use that power that you have in the coming weeks and months and years to tell this story. And with that, we will leave the stage, and the film is about to begin. And thank you for joining us tonight.